Hey, Kyriaki, we can't hear you yet, but if you can switch on your mic, then we can give it a go. Okay, we're just going to wait for a moment. Kyriaki, we still can't hear you. We're just going to wait for a moment to see if you can join us as well. We had a sound check just earlier today, so we know it's working. But I'm seeing a lot of you now. Oh, yes, we can. Hello.
Oh,
excellent.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Apologies for that. Thank you, Marin. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Kyriaki Anagnostopoulou, and I'm the head of e-learning at the University of Bath. I've been in the field of e-learning for approximately 17 years, and through this time I've supported both individuals but also entire institutions. I've taught about learning technologies, I've researched them, I've produced practitioner resources, I've worked in partnership with others to deliver large-scale, often ambitious online projects, including entire master's degrees and more recently some of our massive open online courses. I've also been researching into leadership in e-learning in UK higher education, and I'm establishing some professional networks abroad as well. I also lead a wonderful team of learning technologists and software developers, and we work with a hub and spokes model here in Bath, and we cover a full range of these activities. I'm really excited to be speaking to you today to share some of your experiences about some of my experiences about my strategies for choosing and using learning technologists. But before I continue, I'd like to know a little bit about yourselves. There's quite a few bubbles, and I'm not really sure who my audience is today. There's so many of you. Can I see some smiley faces from those who are learning technologists and staff developers? Okay, quite a few of you. Wonderful. Wonderful. Can I see some green ticks from those of you who are working in industry? Ah, very few. Okay, none. No problem. Can you tell me whether you are designing, use a green tick to let me know whether you are designing online courses at the moment, and that is your main purpose for attending the webinar today. Okay, right, okay, well, predominantly learning technologists from what I can see. So that is wonderful, and some people actually thinking about it. Excellent. Right. Irrespective of what category you're in, I hope you'll find something useful in this presentation. Moving on, in my session, I'm going to be using the term e-learning to mean the use of any technology to enhance learning and teaching. I will be using it as shorthand for the phrases such as technology-enhanced learning, network learning, blended learning, distance learning, and so on. Now, e-learning has become a discipline in its own right, as you know. It is quite unique, especially within institutions, because you'll find that it actually straddles a number of domains. And those people who are implementing e-learning find themselves at the very heart of this Venn diagram. It's an umbrella. E-learning is an umbrella that brings together the academic parts of an institution that are delivering the curriculum, the administrative parts, which support staff and students, and also the technical part of an institution with its infrastructure and software. It truly cuts across the entire institution, and quite often we're seen as people working at the fracture lines of academia. As you can imagine, the skill set and knowledge which is required to work in this space at the heart of this Venn diagram is actually quite vast. And if you're an academic developer or a learning technologist, you'll often find yourself translating and bridging the gap between these domains. Now, I work at an institutional level in my current role, which means that in addition to these three domains and understanding how the overlaps actually happen and what they mean. I'm also asked to understand the institutional context, the mission, the vision of the institution, where we're going, but also tap into what's going on in the higher education sector and keep tabs on what's happening in industry and with employers outside. So it's actually quite a vast knowledge set, and making decisions in such a complex field is actually really not easy. However, today, in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the initial three diagrams, the three circles that I presented earlier. And I'm going to be talking about how we make decisions in relation to learning technologies, very much in a teacher-student sort of setting to enhance the learning experience. Indeed, one of the participants has highlighted, Olaf has highlighted that this is often referred as third space working practices. Now, reflecting on my experiences in higher education, I can see that over the years, we have become more evidence-based and more sophisticated in how we choose our technologies for learning, but also how institutions tend to invest in technologies. Many years ago, when I started in the field, we were quite happy to assume that the use of technology was a good thing because of the potential it offered. It was also quite novel. We based our implementation on rules of thumb. If it had worked before, it will probably work again. If it was a good experience previously, it will probably offer a good experience again. And when we measured success, we started looking at it in relation to face-to-face activities and whether it was good enough or offered an equally rich experience. The sector then started looking at satisfaction, and the use of technology was based on need and the importance of technology to provide a modern education. We were asking whether students were happy with what we were providing. We were asking them whether they would recommend it to their friends and whether they wanted it again. Later on, we looked at expectations, but I can definitely see, even from personal experience, that we've now moved away from that, and we're starting to look at different things. We're starting to look at educational impact. We've gone from proof of concept to actually taking a more evidence, problem-based approach to efficiency, effectiveness, but also educational enhancement. Moving on. Establishing whether we're making the right choices is actually really difficult. As you know, e-learning is all about embedding, whether it's in the curriculum, whether it's in student support, existing practice, and so on. And when something is embedded, it's actually quite difficult to distinguish it from something else and say whether a particular technology has actually made a difference. There are so many variables within the context in which we operate. So how do we know that our choices and strategies are successful? I quite like this graphic. It might be a little bit dated now, in that some technologies no longer exist and some new ones have also appeared on the scene. It is the digital version of the Blues taxonomy that depicts the various stages of learning, along with the tools which might facilitate these levels. However, I do like it because it highlights the importance of using the right tool for the task, and by implication, using the right tool for the right context, but also for the right learner. Ultimately, it highlights that our choices and our decisions are about learning and not about the technology. For those of you working in higher education, you'll probably be familiar with this tripartite structure. There's an intended learning outcome at the very top of this pyramid. We want students to learn something. We want them to achieve something. Quite often it's discipline-based. Sometimes it refers to transferable skills. We want to know whether they've learned it, so we assess them. But also, in order to help them achieve this, we design teaching activities that will help them get there, help them achieve that intended learning outcome. Now, when all three of these work together and they're in sync, all these three components, it's commonly known as constructive alignment. So how do we use technologies as part of this? In this webinar, I'm going to be highlighting the importance of learning design to support our decisions. How many of you are familiar with the concept of learning design? Can I see some green ticks? I'm not seeing any green ticks at the moment. No worries at all. The concept of learning design provides us with a systematic way of developing and describing experiences. Some green ticks are appearing. Wonderful. If you consider, a nice analogy would be to consider learning as a dance. So if they're learning, they're dancing. So if we were talking about learning design, we'd actually be talking about the choreography to this dance. We're talking about the outlines of the steps. We're talking about the sequence. We're talking about the props that are needed. And therefore, learning design includes a description of the learners, the space and the environment in which they learn, but also the tools that they use to interact with each other. I'm going to briefly mention a couple of these frameworks, learning design frameworks, and I'm going to provide some examples of how they've been used to effectively provide guidance for choosing technologies. One example of a framework you may or may not be familiar with is the one developed, it's the AUTC tripartite model of tasks, resources, and supports. And this was developed by Ron Oliver and his colleagues at Edith Cowan University in Australia. He sees learning as a series of tasks that we ask students to do to help achieve the learning outcomes. We may ask them to solve problems, we may ask them to investigate, we may ask them to do role plays and carry out projects. But in order to do those learning tasks effectively, we actually need to give them some resources. And these resources could be in the form of traditional books and papers and articles. They could be online resources, but they also might be quizzes and simulations and more e-learning type infrastructure might be involved in that. Furthermore, in order to help them effectively interact with these resources and carry out the tasks, he says that we actually need to put some support structures in place. And sometimes these support structures might be administrative information, such as deadlines, schedules, calendars, announcements, and so on. Other times it might be more academic support, like tutorials and collaboration and group work. So I quite like this model because it's a nice way of conceptualizing the task at hand and the role that technology can play. In this example, technology is very much seen as a resource. And I will now give you an example that I came across of this type of conceptualization. This case study, this example I came across, comes from John Beasley Murray, who's an academic in Canada. He teaches Latin American studies. He wanted to teach his students about Spanish literature. So to do this, he looked at tasks, resources, and supports, very much the previous model. So he devised a task, he offered them resources, and he put supports in place to help them achieve that task. He wanted them to choose a Spanish author to understand his or her work. He wanted them to work in groups. He asked them to create or improve a Wikipedia article relating to their author of choice. Now, in order to do this, students obviously started reading about Spanish literature, they researched authors, they used technology to collaborate and produce their final assessment. Why I particularly like this example is because it does something that the traditional experience doesn't offer. There are elements of choice, so they could choose their own author. It enables students to master a number of learning outcomes simultaneously, both that are discipline-specific in relation to Latin American studies, but also transferable skills. And it also enables them to enhance their digital literacies. I particularly liked his choice of technology. He used Wikipedia. Now, this is quite often frowned upon within the higher education setting. It is not a system that is supported by our institutions. It's an externally hosted system that we have no control over, and it is there, and quite often we do not see it as academically credible. However, it did provide him with the collaboration tools that he needed. It also provided him with the initial resources for his tasks and the materials, which could be improved by the students. Furthermore, it provided him with peer assessment tools. A simple wiki could have done this. However, what Wikipedia enables him to do is actually make the experience authentic. So students were not only producing these resources for assessment purposes, using possibly a fictional scenario, a problem that we've asked them to solve, or even writing an essay that only one tutor would ever see. What they were producing was actually contributing to knowledge in the widest sense. Their work was being assessed by the tutor, was being assessed by their peers. Wikipedia itself has quality checks, but also it was being assessed by peers around the world that also have opinions and can customize what they've put out there. Ultimately, it offered a really highly unique experience. Now, you might say, oh, yes, of course, that works fine because it's a text-based subject. The same sort of concept was actually used by a completely different subject that's highly visual. This was a landscape architecture course that did something similar. He wanted, Bruce Sharkey wanted his students to understand natural phenomenon and how it impacted on buildings. So he asked them to enhance Wikipedia with particular images that they were asked to draw. And he found that the output was much higher in quality, and the coursework was of much higher quality than students would have usually produced within his module, partly because it was out there and it was public. So, right, that's one example of how one framework can help us structure our choice of learning technologies. There are a number of learning design frameworks out there. Another very common one you may have come across is the hybrid learning model developed by Dominique Verpoorten and her colleagues at the University of Liège. Now, she says that students will only ever do these 8 things within learning. They will debate, they will imitate, they will create, they will explore, and so on. They'll reflect on things. And if we break these tasks down into a sequence of learning events, we can actually then see which tool is more appropriate for using within our educational context. So really interesting, and again, it provides a very structured approach to choosing the tools that we want. If nothing else, what these learning frameworks do is they actually provide us with a vocabulary and a structure for our thinking, but also for our interaction when we are working within a team-based approach for developing courses. However, pedagogy and technology have both moved on over recent years. And the learner is obviously important, including now where there are higher fees within higher education. Designs which put learners at the heart of the system and offer personalized experiences are much preferred. Some of the technology that we now know, for example, I don't know if you've heard of a platform called Newton, which is used in the States. It started off as a K-12 technology, but is now used in higher education. I could academics and teachers would put a number of different resources, and they would use metadata to mark them up to say whether they were basic level resources, intermediate resources, advanced resources, what subject they were referring to, whether they were visual, whether they were text-based, and so on. And they would just put a number of resources within an environment. The system knows who each learner is through a series of questions, has established whether the learner is a visual learner or they prefer text, and it automatically synthesizes a learning experience that is tailored to that specific student. Now that's really interesting because what it does, it removes the learning design. It doesn't make it visible. It makes it invisible to the tutors. Tutors only mark up a number of resources. However, that learning design is inherent within the technology. And in choosing technologies, I think we also really need to consider about what the conceptions of the actual developers were at the time of designing the technology. So a little word of caution there, but again, some really interesting mastery-based recommendation systems that are emerging, that are becoming quite adaptive. Following on from that, again, in terms of adaptation, as I mentioned earlier, I worked at an institutional level. So some of the things that I do involve rolling out technologies on a large scale for everyone to use. Here at the University of Bath, we have about 15,000 students. However, when I introduce and roll out technology, I'm not rolling out a system that will offer a high-quality learning experience to all. But what I aim to roll out is a learning system that will provide 15,000 different high-quality experiences. Each of our students will use it differently. They have different preferences, and they will customize it appropriately. Not all our technologies are flexible enough, but that is the spirit in which we try and roll things out here. One example of an initiative that we had here relates to our digital literacies project. We were given a large GIST grant to explore institutional approaches to developing literacies, digital literacies. As part of that, we defined what we meant by digital literacies. Indeed, each of our faculties defined these. So we had a multitude of definitions, as well as a list of skills and attributes that we wanted our students to develop. Now, we could have put on a series of workshops to address these needs in each of the faculties, but we felt that the learner was the most important person in the process, and they should be able to customize their experience. So we designed an online activity that enabled them to self-assess themselves, to declare their level of confidence against the various categories of digital literacies. We mapped their individual perceptions against what their particular faculty wanted them to achieve. We raised their awareness of what these were. We prompted reflection, and furthermore, we got the system to direct them and recommend activities from around the university that were tailored to their needs, thus defragmenting the experience of trying to find the right course for them. So again, this was bespoke software development. However, this is an example of where we're going and where technology is actually no longer a bolt-on, an additional nice to have, but is actually integrated in the learning experience. From an institutional perspective and also from an individual perspective, we want to use learning technology to offer something highly unique, a pedagogical experience which cannot really be replicated without the use of technology. So I will close my talk with a recent example of how technology enabled us to offer a unique experience as part of one of our very first massive open online courses, which the University of Bath offered on cancer genetics. This was a course that was offered via the FutureLearn platform and was designed in collaboration with my staff here, learning technologists with instructional design, learning design expertise, but also with large academic teams. The technological platform, the openness of it, and the massive nature of it meant that we could offer an experience like no other. Let me explain. This course attracted almost 8,000 participants, and interestingly, it was rated one of the highest, it was one of the best rated courses on the Future Learn platform. The course had 44 participants, had participants from 44 different countries. And what it did, it actually brought together students from A-level through to PhD. It brought together researchers at the cutting edge of cancer research. It brought together medical practitioners. It brought together sufferers and carers with a worldwide perspective into a single online space to gain access to current, up-to-date expertise and learn about this subject. It did indeed offer an experience that money could not buy. It's not an experience that we can easily offer our current students that are studying this topic either. So we had asked our students to register onto this course and experience it with all these perspectives, this worldwide perspective available to them. So this was about using the affordance of technology to offer something that really wasn't available within a traditional setting. And I think that is my closing comment, that when we choose technology, it really needs to add to the learning experience. It really needs to enhance it. It needs to be unique and not seen as a bolt-on and something that would be nice to have. So I will leave you with that thought. I believe I'm passing on the mic to my colleague James Little before we take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyriaki. Before James gets involved, I think it would be great to just pause a moment and thank you for what's been a really interesting first presentation. If anybody has any quick questions for Kyriaki, please post them in the chat window and we'll do our best to respond. But now we're going to have our second presentation and then we'll have discussion at the end with James Little. And James, I hope you are ready to take over the mic and guide us through the next couple of slides.
Hello everyone, just checking you can hear me okay. If so, just put a smiley face. Excellent. So just a quick introduction of myself. I'm James Little. I'm a learning technologist at the University of Leeds. I've been in higher education, being a learning technologist and a staff developer since 2007. Prior to that, I've had quite a lot of experience working in web design and educational consultancy, is basically also kind of producing e-learning. So it's quite an interesting kind of combination coming from the commercial world and going into higher education. So let's give you a brief summary of the second half of the webinar. Kind of got 5 areas to consider really. One is the wider context when we're thinking about strategies and learning technology and kind of the current context that we're finding ourselves in. And then looking at specific areas that we might want to consider within that in terms of students and staff attitudes. And then really the last section is about trying to make sense of an overwhelming choice of information that we have in terms of what we could use, how we could produce things, and try and make sense of that using some theoretical approaches, but then also looking at practical approaches of how we can actually implement some of these aspects of learning technology. Some people are saying that there's poor audio. Let me just turn my microphone up. Has that helped at all? Can people hear a bit better now? Excellent. Okay. So moving on to the first slide. So as Kyriaki mentioned, when I'm thinking about learning technology, I'm also thinking about all the other kind of types of technology. So that's kind of technology enhanced learning, blended learning, distance learning, e-learning, the whole kind of range of phrases that people have come to associate education and technology together. And thinking about, before we're thinking about strategies and approaches to this type of technology, just thinking about the current context. So why are we kind of dabbling with different types of technology? And, you know, being devil's advocate, can we not continue to teach and research as we have done in the past? So what is the wider context? So this is a model I kind of came up with a couple of years ago, trying to identify all of these different aspects that are kind of creeping in. So we've kind of got education in the centre. We've got massive changes in society, the way people are using technology across society. We've got lots of different policies coming out from government bodies like OCTEL, the Higher Educational Academy, influencing and kind of directing the way education is happening in the UK and across the world. Then thinking about kind of commercial and external interests. So we've got a lot of companies that are actually, you know, producing content for other companies as well as directly for the educational market. And then we've kind of got the whole questioning around the purpose of the educational system. You know, is it for work? Is it for deeper understanding? So all these things are kind of going on, and really it leads to kind of this big push towards change. Change is happening. So people are looking at different ways of doing things and achieving things slightly differently to how they have done in the past. So looking more specifically at drivers, now this report was the CISA report from actually 2012, and identified there were 22 specific drivers that came across for why we should be thinking about using learning technology in education. And really distilled, the number one is about enhancing the quality of learning and teaching, widening participation, and attracting / impressing students. Now the other ones are a lot more kind of technical, but really I think the key one is the first one, which is the whole purpose of using any approach to education is to enhance from where we are currently. So from an academic or a teacher perspective, a selection of views that are kind of often seen to come up is that change isn't coming, it's already here, it's going to continue. It's no longer suitable or available to kind of essentially ignore any of the changes that are happening in wider society and how they could be applied to education. But it's genuinely creating a skills gap for all types of staff in trying to make sense of how to use these tools within their current teaching. And, you know, a common complaint is that there's not enough time to catch up. So they're often things to be addressed. And from a student perspective, you know, there's this feeling that technology is being surrounded their kind of everyday experience, and, you know, why isn't it being used in some areas of education? And it's quite clear that as students are individuals, as we all are, that everyone has a different relationship with technology. So we need to be quite careful in making assumptions about certain generations or types of people that they're particularly au fait or not with technology. And then the consumption that if technology is implemented, it should just work. It shouldn't kind of frustrate or add an additional barrier. So to kind of summarise that in the context of education, learning seems to take place in quite the same way, but the changes in the context and expectations and practices have changed to kind of focus around the increasing availability of technology, whether that's internet, mobile devices. There's always a new focus that is being brought along. And this is really raising expectations and also opening up a range of places and locations where students can learn. So what does that really mean for educators and students? And just thinking about students that are currently, this is quite UK-centric or westernised, but in terms of progressing through an education system, it's quite acknowledged that, you know, primary and secondary schools are ahead of higher education in terms of implementing technology. So is there an expectations gap that's being created between one educational section and the next? And then kind of those questions about the expectations of use. So there's an expectation that things are used, but what's the best way of doing it? And bound up in all of this is, where does the learning take place? You know, does it really take place in higher education, for example, in the classroom, or does a lot of it actually take place within seminars, within formal discussions, outside a more formal context? So how can we use technology to access that as well? So looking specifically at some more focused examples, so quite like Kyriaki's kind of Venn diagram, in thinking there's a combination of three areas here. The first would be kind of the pedagogical view. So, you know, what are we trying to do here with technology? Who, why, what, all the learning outcomes, enhancing existing teaching methods and creating or enabling new methods of education. And then kind of the self-awareness, this would equally apply to students or staff, but what skills do I have, what skills do I need to make use of these, and how can this transition or upskilling be achieved? So this focus then thirdly on digital skills is thinking, how can we actually ensure that if we design things using technology, that we're not excluding people and that we really are giving people fair access. So one of the other things is there's an overwhelming choice, I think, of technologies that we can think about. And just to give you an example, you know, this is just a visual representation, I think, of how the app phenomenon has kind of taken off on devices. There's just many available. How do we make, you know, how do we decide what's appropriate, what actually works, and how do we match what we want to do in terms of education with the technology choice that we're having to make? So here are some strategies, and at different levels. So, for example, institutionally supported ones, you've kind of got the VLE, which could be Blackboard on Moodle. You've got things like Lecture Capture. You've got kind of big kind of almost existing suites that, you know, want to consider technology, but MS Office, EndNote, all these things that are kind of centrally supported. Then there's things that people might use specifically for themselves, you know, so screencasting, audio feedback, YouTube, things that you can use on your own terms and integrate if you wish to, but they're not necessarily centrally supported. And then you've got things like a group experience, like this Hangout, this webinar, MOOCs, that are kind of above and beyond one institution. They're kind of across the institution, across the sector. So trying to put these kind of where technology can actually fit within education, I think this is trying to deal with things about where you can access technology as much as where can it be within the educational experience. So kind of the four circles really are kind of the overlapping areas that you can that have already been created in terms of the physical learning spaces, the institutional VLEs. There's personalised learning environments, and then there's all the environments that we might be creating as a mobile experience for people to use on the go. And they're kind of the underpinning architecture. But then along the side, we've got those three areas, and really, you know, technology can be considered at the unit or module level or kind of discrete session by session basis. It can also be considered at a program level, and it could be considered, you know, across a school or institution, so, you know, right across a curriculum. So again, this is the whole context is, it can be quite granular, but it can also be incredibly broad depending on how you choose to view it. So how do we try and make sense of choice and where we perhaps could apply the different types of choices? So here's the three theories I'm going to go through, and please, you know, if you've already encountered these, hopefully one of them will be new to you. But the whole idea of looking at how students and academics and teachers actually make use of technology. So the idea that you could be a resident in technology, which essentially that you can be you live a certain amount of your experience through that technology. So Facebook is a good example. You're actually leaving memories and work there. The VLE could potentially, if you've got an online course, could be used in that way, as opposed to using a technology as a visitor. So, for example, you might just pop in and check your email using internet banking. You're not particularly leaving any footprint or information there. You're just making use of that purely as a tool. And I think that approach can be applied to how you could integrate a particular tool within your teaching. And that applies to both yourself and also how students would perhaps relate to the technology within that context. Now, the seminar model, I think, is a great way of trying to think, I've got all these options, how do I actually want to integrate it? How could I integrate it into my teaching, into my education? And it starts off with kind of this division between enhancement and transformation. It's the idea that you could enhance things by either substituting or augmenting an existing activity. So, for example, I would say that this webinar is kind of an augmentation of a face-to-face meeting. It's a direct substitute of the fact that we could all be in a room meeting, but the augmentation is that we're enabling us to connect without being in the same room. I guess the idea around transformation is that it's enabling things that wouldn't necessarily be possible before. So, for example, if we were to use this facility to share files or create a diagram together at a distance, that would be a modification because we could not physically get 100 people easily in a webinar ad hoc. So really, it's also not to say that the transformation is better than the enhancement. It's just that if you're looking at a particular tool, it's thinking, how does this fit in? Am I replacing something, or I'm actually enabling something new that couldn't be done before? And then finally, just to highlight an approach from Edinburgh Napier, the 3 E's approach, so the idea of enhancing, extending, and empowering. This is kind of an approach that they've taken in a way of looking at how students can really use technology or have it enabled for them to use to support their learning at different types of level. So it basically, there's lots of different ways it can be implemented. It's a really great way of looking at a student-centric way of the effect of using technology rather than worrying about the particular choice and worrying about the specifying of a tool. It's actually looking at the outcome you want and kind of working backwards. So I think it's also fair to say that, there's often, if you just talk technology and education to a lot of people, there's quite rightly some critical voices. So I think it's worth thinking the background context is that there is sometimes a lot of positive talk about it, but then there are actually issues on the ground when it comes to trying to achieve some of these changes. So, for example, in higher education, the slower pace that has happened, in terms of preparedness and the readiness to actually realise the potentials. So I think a lot of kind of everyday activity is about addressing some of the concerns that come from not only change but also kind of the correct implementations of things. So just thinking then about how we can actually implement and share approaches to learning technology. And really, I'm taking from a journey from kind of embedded up to kind of national, international level. So looking at kind of a local level within institutions, it's interesting at the beginning to say that there were a lot of learning technologists here, primarily over other types of staff. And I think a learning technologist as a role can be a bridge. It's kind of a bridge from kind of development of a familiar kind of scenario to one where there's all these different options, new options that are causing you to completely perhaps reevaluate the way you're doing things. So I think there's a kind of it's the departmental and the faculty level, or in the classroom directly, it's quite important, I think, that a role exists where the connections can be made and also supported to provide not only the technical support but also kind of the pedagogical understanding of how things could be implemented on a local level. Thinking about across an institution and approaches. So, for example, here at Leeds, we've got a network that I had just called the Learning Technologists Network at Leeds, and it's a meet-up once every month where people come together and share ideas, problem solutions. So it's kind of creating a community of practice and trying to share different ideas of how things can be implemented. And then more formally, there is the Blended Learning Committee and a team of kind of academic champions and faculty teams that kind of help implement a lot of changes and decisions kind of from a policy level. So to give an example, there's some centrally supported technologies such as Articulate Studio and Adobe Connect, and yet they're kind of supported both centrally and locally at the same time. So people in faculties and departments at the University of Leeds have a key link person that will help them with these particular tools. But then centrally, there's also kind of a whole community of practice of different ideas and different activities that have gone about how to use these particular tools effectively. I'm just thinking that across regions, it's really, a great way of sharing ideas is to join loads of different kind of groups that exist. So just to literally pick a few out of the air. There's the M25 Learning Technology Group based around London. There's the Media Enhanced Learning Special Interest Group that's based kind of around Yorkshire. And there's loads of different kind of pan institution and educational sector groups, which leads me on to kind of, the whole point of sharing approaches through activity like ocTEL, Association for Learning Technology, JISC, is a great way to kind of have a continuing conversation about the best way to do things. And in summary, I kind of, again, to echo some of what Kyriaki was mentioning as well, that there's so much out there, you really have to focus on kind of the pedagogy over technology so that, continuing to have the focus on the purpose of education rather than the tool. And again, that could be considered right from the kind of small granular level right up to kind of program or curriculum or PAM institution level. And really, that it should be considered at the start rather than being bolted on, which is exactly what Kyriaki said as well. So that ideally things work best when they're considered right at the beginning. And also that it's fine to apply theories to try and aid selection. It's kind of grounding the theories in practice. And I think that having that balance of a theoretical understanding as well as a practical awareness of the functions of particular types of technologies that is key in helping understand how that particular tool can enhance the educational purpose. And I don't think it's a problem that actually there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's a complicated area, and that for each situation, you might not only draw on multiple approaches, but there are multiple ways of doing it, which is why I think that the last point of sharing and gaining ideas through multiple networks is really key to trying to continue to understand all the different ways that educational technology is being implemented across the UK and across the world. And that's just to say thank you very much, and any questions?
Thanks very much, James. That was an absolutely brilliant overview. Lots of ideas in the chat as well. We've got a few more moments for discussion, about 10 minutes, and it would be fantastic if you could let us know your questions in the chat window. If you want to use your mic to ask a question, we'll ask you that you can maybe stick to the chat just because we might have lots of questions. But Kyriaki and James and me will do our best to answer your questions. And I wonder, Kyriaki, James, do you want to kick us off with any comments after your presentations, anything you've picked up in the chat window? And for those of you who are keen on getting the badge for this week, the code word is white, like the color. Kyriaki, do you maybe want to go first? Any comments or afterthoughts or anything from the chat you want to pick up?
Thanks, Maren. I have been reading through the chat window as James was presenting, just trying to catch up on a number of things. So I've posted a link to the platform that I talked about that promotes adaptive learning. But it was interesting to hear James' views. I took quite a traditional approach and sort of gone into learning design and looking at strategies for choosing technologies, very, very specific. And James took a greater overview, which was wonderful to hear, and it was quite comforting to hear that we're both recommending the same sort of things. That it is the pedagogy, it is the uniqueness and the embeddedness, but also the fact that there are so many things out there that we could be looking at, and it's often difficult to make those decisions because it's such a broad field, and all we can do really is expose ourselves and be open to ideas, and keep our principles of sound pedagogy really at the forefront.
Great, thank you. I think there is a question that has been coming up through the chat window, which I think James and you could maybe comment on, which is about convincing and involving senior leaders in effective strategies for learning technology and working with senior management, whether it's in a school, college, or university. From your experience, are there any key ingredients to getting it right?
It's quite interesting. I've kind of got two experiences. One is working locally within a school, within a university. And I think the key thing there was trying to kind of, shall we say, raise the importance or raise the awareness of learning technology within the school. And the key thing was basically trying to present the background context for why things couldn't continue as they were. And I was specifically thinking of some distance learning masters that had been running for 5 years, and it had reached the point where they were great when they were started, but because of the march of technology and the kind of richer experience that could be provided, they were kind of looking dated, shall we say. And I think the kind of techniques were just were comparative, so looking across the sector, but then also looking and using that as kind of a motivator to kind of say, well, this is going on, we also need to be doing this, but not just to follow suit, but actually to kind of say, because these are the educational reasons why it would deliver an enhanced experience for the students that are taking part. So I think that balance between addressing things that become updated and raising awareness of them, along with the actual impact, if you can call them that you kind of have to promise, but use kind of your experience to know that they're not just made up, they're actually genuine, evidence-based impacts.
Great, thanks very much, James. Kyriaki, do you have any comments on that question too, on how to work with senior leaders for effective strategies?
My experience of developing strategies and policies within an academic setting have always sort of focused around three things, and James alluded to one of them, and it is very much that evidence base. In one of my slides, I talked about satisfaction, expectations, and finally impact. We're now being asked to demonstrate impact of learning technologies before decisions are made, before investments are made, and policies are written. So that evidence base in terms of tangible benefits for the student community, I think is an absolute must. The other thing that has helped me along the way has been ownership and fostering ownership at those very high levels, giving senior leaders a stake in some of the work that we're doing, and actually making the links back to other missions, visions, strategy, other things that are going on in the institution that we consider to be very important. My previous institution was a post-92 institution in London. It was a post-92 big widening participation agenda, very large. I've now come to a research-intensive institution that is at the top of the league tables. But it's interesting because in both cases, I'm being asked to promote the use of e-learning and enhancing the student learning experience. However, the drivers are very, very different. So again, looking at that ownership and looking at those drivers and where they're coming from is very important. And my final word with regard to getting senior managers on board is also establishing the readiness. And again, James mentioned something around that in his presentation as well. It is about the readiness of the institutions to move forward. And sometimes institutions are happy to just incrementally change things. In some cases, and depending on those external government drivers possibly, or whether it's fees or whether it's research income or whatever it is, sometimes they're ready to make much bigger steps. And it is about taking the opportunity at the right time to make those changes. So those three things: an evidence base, ownership, and readiness would probably be my top three tips around getting senior managers on board.
Great, thanks very much. I think there is a few more questions that we're going to try and pick up in a moment. If Kyriaki and James have another moment, we have a few more questions in the chat. But unfortunately, our time for the formal part of the webinar is now up. And I'd like to thank you all for participating, but also thank Kyriaki and James for really inspiring examples and very thought-provoking ideas that I'm hoping, together with Phil Tubman, the other lead tutor for this week, we'll see lots of discussions about in the ocTEL forums and on your blogs across Twitter. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to find the ocTEL badge for this webinar today as well. If you've got any questions about ocTEL or how to participate in the rest of the week, you can email us as well. Get in touch with us via the ocTEL site. And I'm very much hoping that you'll join us again for next week's webinar, which will be for week 2 of ocTEL starting on Monday. So for now, thank you very much for joining us. And again, thanks to Kyriaki, James, Phil, Caroline, and Martin. Kyriaki and James, if you still have a second, there is a couple of questions in the moderator chat about assessing digital literacy tools and something else. So if you wanted to have a quick look before you head off, that'd be great.
There is a question by Martin Hoxie in relation to the digital literacy assessment tool and whether it is available for others to use. Now, it isn't at the moment. It's in the process of currently being updated. Some early work on the tool, and part of that code comes from the Exeter project as well, and I believe they may have made part of that available. However, we are planning on developing it further. What we need to do is update our definitions of digital literacy and incorporate them into the new tool before we make it available to all our students, and hopefully make it available to others.
Thanks very much. I think the other question is for you as well, Kyriaki, which is about the 3 differences or the key differences of your system and a learning management system. Any initial thoughts on that?
I'm unclear about what is referred to as my system. Does this relate to the Newton platform that I talked about? I'm unsure. I would need a bit of a clarification there, I'm afraid.
Great. I think the participant Moira, who's asked a question, is still in the session. So Moira, if you wanted to ask a follow-up, we can then hopefully answer your question. Unfortunately, we can't hear your mic, Moira. You might need to use the chat window. But in the meantime, if anybody has any final questions for James or Kyriaki, please post them in the chat window and we'll do our best to answer. Otherwise, we'll wish you a very nice afternoon. I think Moira is just typing Kyriaki, so that's great.
Okay, thank you.
In the meantime, we also have a question from Paul, who's talking, curious whether maybe James, this is something you could answer, whether you struggle with staff engagement.
Yeah, I think that's it's true to say that staff engagement can vary. I think it can vary depending on what's trying to be achieved. So thinking back to my previous institution when I was working in a particular department, we eventually got around the issue of staff engagement, which seemed to centre around time, not willingness to engage or think around things. It was purely time, by making sure that there was agreement that a certain amount of time was actually released for staff to go on additional training or different kind of sessions that were run in order to kind of think about the different educational things that were being designed. So, but I think on a general level, I think at the institutional level, it's quite hard to reach all staff. And I think that can vary. Sometimes it can be because the institution itself is incredibly large, so it's hard to actually get a message from the centre out to kind of trickle down, or just because people have to want to engage or be convinced that it's important. And I think that's kind of often half of the issue, that it needs to be a conversation about the educational side of things rather than we've got this tool and we're going to force you to use it, which I think is kind of something that often gets a knee-jerk reaction of, well, I'm not using that or I'm not engaging. So I think generally staff engagement is always a battle to be kind of encouraged, you know, to be kind of thought through and try to unpick why is it where individuals or particular groups are not engaging, what is it and what's the real kind of the undertones there.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're running nearly out of time now, so I'm going to give James and Kyriaki both the opportunity to make any final comments, pick up any final questions before we close. Kyriaki, anything final comments or answers from you?
I know there's been quite a few questions around the slides. I believe, Maren, that these will be made available to the participants. If there's any further information that you would like me to include, any particular links or so on, then please do let me know. I'm very happy to do so. And I would just like to really thank all the participants for their questions and for patiently listening to us for the last hour. I'm very happy to interact with all of you again soon. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kyriaki. And yes, we'll be able to make the slides available via the ocTEL website. James, last comments from you.
Yes, just much again the same really. I guess a closing comment would be that the harder you look, or the further you look into things, the more complicated it seems to get. So it's quite, it's okay to be confused and to think things are complicated in terms of that intersection between learning technology and education. And that really, you know, just keep on being curious and asking questions, because that's how you form opinions and try to find the best, do the best that you can. So again, just to echo Kyriaki's, it's been great to have people attend and listen to us, and yeah, we're happy to continue the conversations on the ocTEL site or via email.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And as most of you will know, there is a forum specifically about strategies for learning technology on the ocTEL site. We hope to be able to carry on the conversation there. But for now, I'd like to thank again James and Kyriaki and everybody else for participating. Wish you a good afternoon. Goodbye.